Number 10. Nuclear Submarine Graveyard. In the freezing cold waters of northern Russia, there are enough discarded submarine nuclear reactors to produce more than 6.5 times the radiation seen at Hiroshima. These nuclear reactors are sitting just underneath the surface of the sea, some still with fuel inside them. According to popular mechanics, it's only a matter of time before corrosion eats its way through the metal and releases the uranium waiting within them. And once that happens, there will be an uncontrolled release of radioactivity into the Arctic Ocean. This has been a problem for decades. As far back as the Soviet Union, the Russians have been dumping nuclear waste and abandoned submarines into the Kara Sea. There are at least 14 reactors that we know of, and an undetermined number of crippled submarines that were deemed too expensive to take care of and too dangerous to decommission. So, they were just dumped into the sea. What we have here in this remote northern part of the world, a place that seems so peaceful and relaxing, is a graveyard of rusting submarines and nuclear time bombs. Just about every scientist agrees that at some point, the discarded subs and nuclear reactors will cause a nuclear catastrophe. This disaster will undoubtedly be worse than anything the world has ever seen. To give you an idea of how many nuclear submarines Russia has had over the years, let's take a quick look at their history. It was in the first half of the 20th century that the Soviet Union engineered more nuclear-powered submarines than every other nation combined. At their height in the 1990s, they had 245 nuclear subs in total. Over half of them were equipped with dual reactors, and over a third sailed with a dozen nuclear warheads. Sadly, nuclear submarines only have a shelf life of about 30 years maximum. It's been 30 years now since 1992, which means just about every submarine that was functional is reaching its expiration date. A lot of them have ended up in the graveyard in the Kara Sea. Number 9. The Moynok Ship Graveyard. There's a bizarre ship graveyard in the country of Uzbekistan called the Moynok Ship Graveyard. It's partly a cemetery of wrecked vessels and partly a ghost town. What makes it so bizarre is that the nearest source of water is 100 miles away. These boats are now sitting in the middle of the desert, although at one point they'd been floating in one of the largest lakes in the world. The Moynok Ship Graveyard and Ghost Town was once a bustling fishing port on the Aral Sea. It was one of the 4 biggest lakes in the world at 26,300 square miles. But when the rivers that fed the lake were diverted on purpose to irrigate crops, the lake dried up. Now it's nothing but a desert with the hulls of ships disintegrating in the scorching heat as they sit upright in the sand. To give you an idea of how damaging this was, scientists consider the extinction of the Aral Sea to be one of the most catastrophic environmental disasters in human history. All the fish died, every town on its shores was abandoned, and the Aral Sea is now known as the Aralkum Desert. This was all done so that Uzbekistan could water its cotton fields and prop up its cotton industry. Number 8. Cruise Ship Graveyard. Turkey is home to a ship graveyard on their east coast, a strip of shoreline where huge luxury cruise liners sit broken and waiting to be turned into scrap metal. While there's always been a lot of business for the cruise ship graveyard, the COVID-19 pandemic made business really pick up. Once everyone was too terrified to get on a boat with hundreds of strangers, the cruise industry crashed. And when it crashed, the boats had to be scrapped. The Cruise Lines International Association predicted that the global cruise line industry would lose about $115 billion. At the ship graveyard of Aliaga, workers prepared in the early days of the pandemic to scrap over 1 million tons of metal. Ships abandoned here are stripped down, and 98% of the vessels can be turned into scrap metal. Things like life jackets and whatever else is left over is then sold off to the highest bidders. Some of the most famous cruise ships in the world met their death here, like the Sovereign of the Seas and Carnival Fantasy, some of the biggest mega cruise ships ever built. In 2022, the cruise industry made a huge comeback after the pandemic, but the ship graveyard of Aliaga is still in business and still booming. Number 7. Alang Shipbreaking Yard. The biggest shipbreaking yard in the world is located in India. The Alang Shipbreaking Yard can be found on the Gulf of Khambat and is responsible for recycling roughly half of all the ships salvaged on the planet, which is an immense number of boats. The shipyard was established in 1983 and is worth somewhere around $110 billion today. It's made a fortune by taking ruined vessels and turning them into profit. The facility itself consists of 183 individual breaking yards. These yards are positioned along a strip of coastline nearly 10 miles long. When ships are no longer needed and are ready to be scrapped, they're towed here and then left to the salvagers. Supertankers, ferries, container ships, ocean liners, and nearly everything that floats is brought here to die. The boats are brought onto the beach and stranded. At any point in time, this place is a ship purgatory with boats spread out along the coastline waiting to be stripped apart. Manual laborers wait for the tide to go out, then hurry down to the beached boats with their tools. They dismantle each ship as they go like an army of hungry ants, salvaging anything of use and scrapping the rest. At the shipyard's height in 2011 and 2012, they processed 415 vessels. One of the most famous boats they ever took apart was the Seawise Giant in December of 2009, which was the longest ship ever built. Number 6. Bikini Atoll. Bikini Atoll is a small cluster of 23 islands in the South Pacific, and the whole place is considered a ship graveyard by the U.S. Navy. Some of the most important ships that fought in World War II are currently sitting at the bottom of the lagoon here, but not because they were casualties of war. Most of the ships lying dead at the bottom of Bikini Atoll were used as target practice for nuclear bombs. On July 25, 1946, the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga was wiped out by an atomic blast here that lifted the ship out of the water and flipped it on its side. The U.S. military was testing nuclear detonations and using the vessel for target practice. It had survived the Battle of Iwo Jima, the first nuclear weapons test during Operation Crossroads, and then was obliterated by the second test. The USS Saratoga is not alone at the bottom of Bikini Atoll. The target fleet during the nuclear tests of 1946 included 4 battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, 11 destroyers, 2 cruisers, 8 submarines, and 3 captured enemy ships. The most famous enemy ship blown up here was the Japanese battleship Nagato. It currently lies upside down in the lagoon with all the other ships in the graveyard. Do you think nuclear testing should still be allowed for the U.S. Navy? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Number 5. Fleet of the Outer Banks. One of the largest ship graveyards is spread across the coast of the Outer Banks with over 5,000 wrecks stuck beneath the water. For centuries, boats off the coast of North Carolina have been getting caught in storms and broken on sandbars. The Diamond Shoals near Cape Hatteras have caused the loss of at least several thousand ships since record-keeping began in 1526. Some call the whole stretch of coastline the graveyard of the Atlantic because it's so effectively clogged with wrecks. The USS Monitor is down there somewhere, as well as the USS Patriot, 2 ships that fought during the American Civil War. The pirate Blackbeard also crashed his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, here in 1718. For nearly 500 consecutive years, boats have been lost from Cape Lookout to Cape Fear, and as far north as Chicamacomico and Bodie Island. However, by far the most notorious place is Cape Hatteras. This was the toughest part of the coast to navigate for ancient seafarers and early settlers. There are so many shipwrecks close to the beach that many of the earliest residents here made their livelihood from scavenging shipwrecks or even tricking ships into their own destruction. People would tie a lantern to the neck of a horse, walk the horse up and down a beach, and thereby trick sea captains into following the false light. They would crash their ship, and the residents of Cape Hatteras would go down and pillage whatever they could find. In World War II, Cape Hatteras was a popular ambush spot for German U-boat captains. They would prey on freighters and tankers moving up the coastline, torpedoing hundreds of ships throughout the war. It became known as Torpedo Alley due to all of the destruction. Number 4. Garden Island Graveyard. In the Port Adelaide River in Australia, there's a mysterious ship graveyard filled with abandoned vessels. It's just off the coast of Garden Island, home to ships from as far back as 1856. The boat graveyard is a haven for marine creatures frequented by dolphins and is a sanctuary for wild birds. It's also a popular canoe destination, as tourists can paddle through the ripped-apart hulls and cracked remains of long-dead vessels. For those with enough courage, they can even strap on a diving suit and walk along the bottom of the river where the most terrifying shipwrecks are found. In total, there are 26 deceased vessels in the river. Sailing ships, ferries, pontoons, and more modern motorboats are among the remains. The waterway is hemmed by a mangrove forest, making it an important ecosystem for land and marine animals. And while it's fairly peaceful today, that wasn't always the case. In the early 20th century, when most of the boats were scrapped, they were blown apart with explosives and allowed to sink to the bottom of the river. Back then, not much care was given as to what impact exploding boats might have on the environment. Number 3. The Bay of Nudabihu. One of the largest ship graveyards in the world is located in the Bay of Nudabihu, Mauritania. From the city's coastline, you can see giant rusting ships in every direction you look. These vessels have been there for decades, most of them abandoned illegally because it was too expensive to properly dismantle them. The city of Nudabihu, while extraordinarily beautiful, is also poor with few employment opportunities for its citizens. Because of its economic hardship and widespread corruption, ship owners have been able to pay bribes to abandon their unwanted vessels in the bay. This was particularly prevalent in the 1980s, with everything from fishing trawlers to naval cruisers being dumped in the shallow bay amidst the coral. There are over 300 ships here and potentially more that remain hidden under the surface of the water. Despite the concern of environmentalists that toxic oils and paint will seep into the waters of the bay and pollute the natural ecosystem, the wrecks have done wonders for fish. They've managed to provide new habitats for marine creatures, giving the fishing industry in the city a big boost. They might leak some toxic materials, but the fish seem to appreciate the housing, and the shipwrecks are slowly becoming part of the bay. Number 2. Nudabihu. In Nudabihu, France, there's a graveyard of warships from the Cold War. The graveyard is positioned in a bend of the river Alang, a special chunk of water where the depth is always 33 meters no matter how high the tide. The nearby hills block out the wind, and so the water is always eerily calm. However, underneath the surface, there are the rusty and ugly remains of long-lost naval vessels. The naval history of this particular stretch of river on the coast of France goes back to 1840. At this time, the first naval station was built here and manned by about 200 sailors. During World War II, the base was taken over by Germans. Then, after the war, a lot of ships were decommissioned and used as breakwaters to protect the coast. During the Cold War, French naval vessels that weren't needed anymore were brought here and mothballed. Number 1. The Tugboat Graveyard. Off the coast of Staten Island, there's a tugboat graveyard with roughly 24 busted ships slowly decaying. The ships are located between Staten Island and New Jersey in the Arthur Kill waterway. This is where the Witt Marine Equipment Company has been busy over the last 100 years dismantling ships from what had once been a pretty bustling coastline. New York isn't quite as active as it once was with boats, but there's still a steady stream of salvage work for the company. There's almost too much work, and tugboats and small harbor ships have been accumulating on the shores for decades. There just isn't the manpower or desire to get rid of everything. What's happened is that a tugboat graveyard has inadvertently formed here, and it looks like a mass of floating garbage. The waterway is already polluted, and the tugboat graveyard just makes it look worse. Although these were once seaworthy boats, they've now turned the water into a sloppy soup of metal parts and chunks of wood. Which of these incredible ship graveyards is your favorite? Let us know in the comments, and thanks for watching. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.